Every Friday morning, dozens of visitors arrived at the U.S. Army Engineer Museum inside Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. Families wandered through the exhibits, retired veterans searched for old memories, and new soldiers paused to learn the history of the Engineer Corps before beginning their own careers. Among them walked a 79-year-old man wearing a faded denim jacket, a worn Army engineer cap, and carrying an old leather blueprint tube over one shoulder. He leaned on a polished oak cane and moved slowly from one building to another, stopping every few minutes to quietly study the walls, roads, and parade grounds. A group of young soldiers noticed him almost immediately. "That old guy's been staring at the buildings for 20 minutes, one private whispered. Another laughed. "Probably just another tourist pretending he served here." A third smiled as the elderly man gently touched the corner of an old concrete wall. "Careful, Grandpa. The museum's inside." "Not out here." The old man simply smiled and continued walking. He eventually stopped beside the headquarters building, reached into his blueprint tube, and carefully removed a faded set of original construction drawings. One young corporal frowned. "Sir, visitors aren't allowed to leave papers lying around government property." The old man nodded politely and rolled the drawings back together. "You're right. I'm sorry if we're interrupting your visit," the corporal continued. "But unless you're part of today's historical tour, you'll need to stay with the visitor group." The elderly man smiled warmly. "I understand." Just as he prepared to walk away, a white command vehicle turned the corner and stopped beside the headquarters entrance. The installation commander stepped out, glanced toward the old visitor, and immediately began walking much faster than anyone expected. Before the soldiers could react, the commanding general stopped in front of the elderly man, came to attention, and rendered a crisp military salute. "Chief Engineer Robert Bob Harrison," he said proudly, "welcome back to the base you helped build." Every soldier standing nearby froze. Moments earlier, they had assumed the quiet old man was simply another curious tourist. None of them realized that more than 50 years earlier, Robert Harrison had been one of the Army engineers who designed and supervised the construction of much of the training complex they walked across every single day. Inside the faded blueprint tube were the original hand-drawn plans, personal notes from the construction crews, and one sealed envelope that had remained unopened for half a century. A letter written by a young engineer who never lived to see the base completed. Before the day was over, everyone on the installation would discover why one elderly visitor still knew every road, every building, and every tree by heart, and why the strongest foundations of a military base are sometimes built not only with concrete and steel, but with sacrifice, friendship, and promises that survive long after the builders are gone. Nearly every morning, visitors arrived at Fort Leonard Wood to tour the U.S. Army Engineer Museum. Before watching young soldiers train across one of the Army's largest engineering installations, most people admired the armored vehicles, historic bridges, and military equipment on display. But 79-year-old Robert Bob Harrison seemed interested in none of them. Wearing a faded denim jacket, an old Army engineer cap, leaning on a polished oak cane, and carrying a weathered leather blueprint tube over one shoulder, he walked slowly through the installation, stopping every few steps to study an old building, gently touch a concrete wall, or quietly smile at a row of towering oak trees beside the headquarters. To everyone passing by, he looked like nothing more than an elderly tourist lost in old memories. A group of young engineer soldiers soon noticed him. One private nudged his friend and whispered, "That old guy has been walking around the same street for almost an hour." Another laughed. "He's probably trying to remember where the museum entrance is." A third smiled, as Robert carefully examined a weathered concrete support column. "Sir, the exhibits are over there." Robert looked toward them and smiled warmly. "Thank you, but I'm exactly where I wanted to be." The answer only made the young soldiers laugh even more. A corporal walked over politely. "Excuse me, sir. Visitors aren't allowed inside the headquarters construction area." Robert nodded without the slightest complaint. "I understand." The corporal pointed toward the leather blueprint tube resting on his shoulder. "May I ask what's inside?" Robert answered calmly. "Old drawings." "For the museum?" the corporal asked. Robert smiled and gently shook his head. "No. For this place." The soldiers exchanged amused glances. One of them chuckled. "This base was built more than 50 years ago." "I know," Robert replied. "Then why bring the blueprints?" Robert rested one hand on the old leather tube. "Sometimes it's nice to see how closely reality followed the plans." None of the young soldiers understood what he meant. Before anyone could ask another question, Robert carefully removed several yellowed blueprints from the tube. The fragile paper was covered with faded pencil marks, measurements, handwritten notes, and coffee stains left decades earlier. Just as he began unfolding the first page, the corporal stepped forward again. "Sir, I'm sorry, but I can't allow you to spread those out here." Robert smiled kindly, rolled the drawings back together, and slipped them into the tube once more. Fair enough. He adjusted the strap over his shoulder and slowly turned as though preparing to leave. At that very moment, a white command vehicle entered the courtyard and stopped abruptly in front of headquarters. Before the driver could even open the door, Brigadier General David Collins stepped out and immediately spotted the elderly man walking away. "Mr. Harrison," the general called loudly. Every soldier instinctively turned toward the voice. General Collins quickly crossed the courtyard, stopped directly in front of Robert, came to attention, and rendered a flawless military salute. "Chief Engineer Robert Harrison," he said with unmistakable respect. "Welcome home." The courtyard fell completely silent. The same young soldiers who had been laughing only moments earlier stood frozen in disbelief. Without saying another word, General Collins gently accepted the old leather blueprint tube with both hands, as though it contained something priceless. Robert smiled softly. "I told you they were drawings for this place." No one laughed this time. Collins turned toward the young engineer soldiers and asked, "Do any of you know who this man is?" No one answered. The general smiled. "Every road you march on, every barracks you sleep in, every classroom where you study, and much of the headquarters behind you first existed inside this blueprint tube." The soldiers stared silently at Robert. Collins continued. "More than 50 years ago, before a single building stood on this ground, Chief Engineer Robert Harrison helped design and supervise the construction of much of the installation you're standing on today." Complete silence settled across the courtyard. The laughter had vanished completely. In its place was something none of the young soldiers had expected to feel only a few minutes earlier: deep and genuine respect. The courtyard remained silent long after Brigadier General David Collins introduced Robert Harrison. The young engineer soldiers looked at the elderly man with entirely different eyes. Only minutes earlier, they had mistaken him for a curious tourist. Now they stood before one of the engineers, who had helped shape the very installation where they trained every day. General Collins carefully carried the old leather blueprint tube himself as he walked beside Robert toward the headquarters building. "I've been looking forward to this visit for years," he said. Robert smiled faintly. "I wasn't sure I'd ever come back." "Why now?" Collins asked. Robert looked across the parade field where hundreds of young soldiers were completing morning drills. "Because I wanted to know whether the place still belonged to the people who built it, or to the people who serve here now." Collins nodded thoughtfully. "I think you'll like the answer." Inside the headquarters conference room, several senior officers were already waiting. The moment Robert entered, every officer stood. Without being asked, they applauded quietly. Robert looked slightly embarrassed. "Please don't do that." Collins smiled. "You've earned it." Robert gently shook his head. "The men who poured the concrete earned it. The welders earned it. The crane operators earned it. I only happened to be holding the drawings." He carefully placed the leather blueprint tube on the conference table and slowly unrolled the yellowed plans. The room immediately grew quiet. Spread across the table was the original hand-drawn layout of Fort Leonard Wood from more than 50 years earlier. Every road, every barracks, every bridge, every training range had been drawn by hand in faded pencil. Red notes covered the margins. Measurements had been erased and rewritten dozens of times. Coffee stains marked several corners. One young captain leaned closer. "Those are the original plans?" Robert nodded. "The first complete set. They're beautiful." Robert smiled. At the time, they just looked unfinished. The officers laughed softly. Robert pointed toward a section near the center of the map. "That road wasn't supposed to curve." Collins looked surprised. "Really?" Robert nodded. "We discovered a grove of oak trees right where the bulldozers were scheduled to begin clearing." "So you changed the road?" One of the workers asked if we could save the trees. Robert smiled. "I said we'd move the road instead." The room became quiet. Collins looked out the window toward the same line of oak trees, still standing outside headquarters. "Those trees?" Robert nodded. "They're older than every building on this installation." Several officers exchanged smiles. One lieutenant quietly said, "I've walked past them every day for 3 years." Robert looked at him. "Good. Why?" because that means we made the right decision. Collins carefully turned another blueprint over. Tucked beneath it was a black and white photograph, showing dozens of construction workers standing in front of the unfinished headquarters building. Most of them were covered in dust and concrete. Robert reached down and gently touched one face near the back row. His name was Thomas Bennett. Collins recognized the name immediately. The young structural engineer? Robert nodded. 26 years old. He never saw the project finished. Robert's smile slowly faded. No. He looked quietly at the photograph, but he made sure everyone else would. The room fell silent once again. Collins looked toward the old leather blueprint tube. Is that why you came back? Robert rested one hand on the photograph before answering. Partly. Then, he looked at the sealed envelope still hidden inside the tube. The rest of the reason has been waiting 53 years. No one in the room yet understood what the envelope contained. But judging by the way Robert looked at it, they knew it carried something far more valuable than blueprints. It carried a promise that time itself had never been able to erase. The conference room remained quiet, as Robert Harrison gently held the old black and white photograph in his hands. Every officer gathered around the table noticed the way his fingers paused over the young engineer standing near the back row. Brigadier General David Collins finally asked the question everyone was thinking. Who was Thomas Bennett? Robert smiled softly without taking his eyes off the photograph. The best engineer on the project. One captain looked surprised. Better than you? Robert chuckled. Much better. A few officers smiled. Robert carefully laid the photograph beside the faded blueprints. Thomas graduated near the top of his engineering class. He could solve structural problems faster than anyone I'd ever met. But that's not what made him unforgettable. Collins leaned forward. What did? Robert looked toward the headquarters building outside the window. He believed buildings should take care of people long after the builders were gone. The officers exchanged puzzled glances. Robert pointed toward the blueprint spread across the table. See these barracks? Several officers nodded. The original design placed the windows on the opposite side. One lieutenant frowned. Why were they changed? Robert smiled. Thomas spent an afternoon watching recruits march across the parade field. And? He realized that every summer afternoon the sun would turn those rooms into ovens. Robert tapped the drawing. So he redesigned every window. Another officer looked surprised. That must have delayed construction. It did. Was headquarters happy? Robert laughed quietly. Not even a little? The room filled with gentle laughter. Thomas told the colonel something I'll never forget. Collins smiled. What was it? Robert answered without hesitation. Sir, soldiers can't fight well if they can't sleep. Silence settled over the room. Robert continued turning the pages. The sidewalks were his idea too. One captain looked confused. Sidewalks? Robert nodded. Originally there weren't enough. Why not? Budget cuts? Robert smiled. Thomas said tired soldiers would always choose the shortest path. He pointed toward several curved sidewalks drawn in pencil. He predicted exactly where people would walk. Collins looked toward the window. They're still the busiest sidewalks on base. Robert nodded proudly. Because people haven't changed. A young major quietly asked, did he design anything else? Robert smiled. Almost everything people never notice. Like what? Drainage systems? Water lines? Storm shelters? Foundations beneath the parade field. The officers listened carefully. Robert rested one hand on the blueprint. The strongest parts of a building are usually the ones no one ever sees. Collins looked thoughtfully at Robert. Just like good leaders, Robert smiled. Thomas used to say the same thing. He slowly reached inside the blueprint tube again and removed a small leather notebook covered with dried concrete dust. This belonged to him. Carefully opening it, Robert revealed pages filled with sketches instead of calculations. One page showed soldiers laughing beneath newly planted trees. Another showed recruits sitting in the shade outside the barracks. Another showed families watching graduation ceremonies from benches facing the parade field. A lieutenant looked puzzled. Those aren't engineering drawings. Robert shook his head. No. Then what are they? Robert smiled. Reasons. Reasons? Thomas believed every blueprint should begin with the people who would one day live there. Complete silence filled the room. Robert slowly turned to the final page. Across the bottom, written in neat handwriting, were just two sentences. Concrete holds buildings together. People hold everything else together. Never confuse the two. No one spoke. Brigadier General Collins quietly closed the notebook after reading the words. I've served here for 6 years, he said softly. I thought I knew the history of this installation. He looked at Robert with deep respect. Now I realize I've only known the buildings. Robert smiled gently. The buildings were always the easy part. Collins looked toward the old leather blueprint tube still resting on the table. And the envelope? Robert's expression grew noticeably quieter. He rested one hand on the sealed letter hidden beneath the remaining blueprints. Thomas gave it to me the day before the accident. Every officer in the room became still. Robert looked down at the faded envelope. I've carried it for 53 years. He paused. Tomorrow, I'll finally open it. The room remained completely silent after Robert Harrison mentioned the accident. No one interrupted him. No one asked another question. Brigadier General David Collins quietly looked at the faded envelope still resting beneath the yellowed blueprints. You never opened it? He asked softly. Robert slowly shook his head. Thomas made me promise. Collins frowned slightly. What kind of promise lasts 53 years? Robert gently lifted the envelope into his hands. The paper had become brittle with age, but the handwriting across the front remained clear. For Bob, open only after the base is finished, and after you've seen another generation of soldiers call it home. Several officers quietly exchanged glances. Robert smiled sadly. The base was finished long ago. He paused for a moment, but I wasn't ready. Collins nodded. Until today, Robert looked through the window toward the parade field where hundreds of young engineer soldiers were training beneath the Missouri sun, until I knew the place still belonged to them. He carefully broke the old seal. The room became so quiet that everyone could hear the paper unfolding. Robert took a slow breath before reading aloud. Bob, if you're holding this letter, then I probably never had the chance to complain about your coffee one last time. Gentle laughter briefly softened the emotion in the room. Robert smiled as he continued. If the buildings are standing, don't thank me. Thank every worker who stayed after dark, every welder who refused shortcuts, every equipment operator who treated each foundation like soldiers would one day trust their lives to it. He paused, his voice growing quieter. People will admire the headquarters, the bridges, and the parade field. That's fine, but I hope someone remembers that the most important part of every building is the part no one ever sees. Collins slowly lowered his head. Robert continued reading. Foundations don't ask for recognition. They simply carry the weight above them. That's what real leaders do too. No one in the room moved. Robert reached the final paragraph. One day, young soldiers will walk these roads without knowing our names. That's exactly how it should be. If we did our jobs well, they won't think about the people who built this place. They'll simply feel safe, because we did. Robert's hands trembled slightly as he read the last sentence. Promise me one thing, Bob. If you ever come back here after I'm gone, don't tell them I helped build a military base. Tell them we tried to build a place worthy of the people who would serve here. Robert slowly folded the letter and looked out the window. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Brigadier General Collins quietly walked to the conference room door. There's something you need to see, he said. A few minutes later, Robert stood once again outside the headquarters building. More than 500 young engineer soldiers had assembled across the parade field after hearing that one of the original builders of the installation had returned. Collins stepped onto the reviewing platform and spoke into the microphone. This morning, many of you believed Mr. Robert Harrison was simply an elderly visitor looking at old buildings. He looked toward Robert with a smile. The truth is, every one of us has spent years walking through his life's work. He raised the letter into the air. Today we've learned something even more important. The greatest builders aren't remembered because they constructed buildings. They're remembered because they built places where others could serve, grow, and come home. The entire formation remained silent. Robert looked across the sea of young faces and realized that Thomas Bennett's final wish had finally come true. The buildings had never been the real legacy. The people were. The parade field remained silent after Brigadier General David Collins finished reading Thomas Bennett's letter. More than 500 engineer soldiers stood motionless, not because they had been ordered to, but because every word had reminded them that they were standing on something far greater than concrete and steel. Robert Harrison slowly stepped onto the reviewing platform, carrying the old leather blueprint tube beneath one arm. He looked across the formation and smiled gently. 53 years ago, he began, this place was nothing but mud, survey stakes, and a few lines drawn on paper. A few quiet smiles appeared among the soldiers. We didn't see barracks. He looked toward the headquarters building. We saw future soldiers. He turned toward the training fields. We didn't build roads. We built the paths thousands of young men and women would walk on their first day in uniform. He rested one hand on the weathered blueprint tube, and we didn't pour foundations just to hold buildings. He paused. We poured them so families could one day watch their sons and daughters graduate safely on this parade field. Complete silence settled across the installation. Robert slowly removed the original blueprint from the leather tube one final time. The paper was fragile, its corners faded by time, but every pencil line was still visible. He carefully held it beside the modern aerial photograph of the base that General Collins had placed on an easel. The two images matched almost perfectly. Roads, bridges, barracks, classrooms, and training grounds stood exactly where they had first been imagined more than half a century earlier. The soldiers looked back and forth between the drawing and the buildings surrounding them. For the first time, they understood that every structure around them had once existed only as hope sketched in pencil. General Collins then stepped forward carrying a polished wooden display case. Inside rested Robert's engineer cap, Thomas Bennett's leather notebook, the original blueprints, and the letter that had remained unopened for 53 years. Robert looked surprised. "What's this?" Collins smiled. "The museum staff finished it yesterday." "Yesterday? We hoped you'd come." Robert laughed quietly. "You were more confident than I was." Collins looked toward the formation. "Beginning today, these will become part of the Engineer Heritage Gallery." He gently closed the display case, not because they're old, but because every young engineer deserves to know what real service looks like. Robert looked at the young soldiers standing before him. "If you remember anything about us," he said softly, "don't remember our names." He pointed toward the roads stretching across the installation. "Remember that every decision you make will someday become someone else's everyday life." He smiled. "Build accordingly." Brigadier General Collins then faced the formation, Engineer Battalion. His voice carried across the parade field. "Present. Arms." In perfect unison, hundreds of soldiers raised their hands in salute toward the elderly engineer. Robert slowly returned the salute, his weathered hand trembling slightly beneath the brim of his faded cap. Tears quietly filled his eyes as he looked once more across the installation he had helped create so many years earlier. "Thomas," he whispered almost silently, "they took good care of it." Years later, after Robert Harrison passed away peacefully at the age of 88, every new engineer soldier arriving at Fort Leonard Wood began orientation with a visit to the Engineer Heritage Gallery before learning how to construct bridges, roads, or defensive positions. They first stood before the simple wooden display containing the old blueprint tube, the faded plans, Thomas Bennett's notebook, and the letter that had crossed more than half a century before reaching its destination. Beside the display rested a bronze plaque bearing the words, "The greatest engineers are remembered not for the buildings they leave behind, but for the lives those buildings continue to protect." Every instructor paused there before beginning the first lesson. They reminded new soldiers that engineering was never only about measurements, calculations, or concrete. It was about people. Most visitors believed they were looking at old construction drawings preserved inside a museum. Those who knew the full story understood they were looking at something far more valuable, a promise between two friends, a legacy built with quiet service, and the invisible foundation of character that continued supporting every soldier who walked across the base long after its builders were gone. Buildings eventually grow old. Roads crack. Concrete weathers. Steel rusts. Every structure that human hands create will one day require repair or replacement. Yet there is one kind of foundation that time can never destroy. It is the foundation built by people who choose to serve others without expecting to be remembered. Robert Harrison understood that truth long before the first truck arrived at the construction site. He knew that a military base was never simply a collection of buildings. It was a place where frightened young recruits would become confident soldiers, where lifelong friendships would begin, where families would celebrate graduations, and where countless service members would prepare to protect people they had never met. That was the real project he and his fellow engineers were building. Thomas Bennett left behind an equally powerful lesson. He was only 26 years old, yet he understood something many people never discover in an entire lifetime. The most important part of any structure is usually the part no one ever sees. The same is true of leadership, character, and kindness. The strongest people are often the quiet ones carrying responsibilities without asking for recognition. Like a foundation buried beneath the ground, their work supports everyone above them while remaining almost invisible. The young soldiers made the same mistake many of us make every day. They looked at an elderly man with a cane and an old leather blueprint tube and assumed he was nothing more than a curious tourist searching for memories. They never imagined they were speaking to someone whose ideas had shaped the roads they marched on, the barracks where they slept, and the classrooms where they learned. It is a reminder that every stranger has a story, and sometimes the quietest person in the room has contributed more than anyone realizes. Robert often said that every decision an engineer makes eventually becomes someone else's everyday life. Those words reach far beyond construction. Every choice we make becomes part of another person's experience. A kind word can become someone's strength. A promise faithfully kept can inspire an entire generation. A single act of integrity can become a foundation that supports people long after we are gone. Perhaps the most unforgettable moment in this story was not when the commanding general saluted Robert Harrison or when hundreds of soldiers honored him on the parade field. It was the moment everyone realized that the greatest builders are remembered not because they created impressive buildings, but because they created places where other people could live, grow, serve, and come home safely. That is the kind of legacy no blueprint can fully capture. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Have you ever known an engineer, builder, veteran, teacher, mentor, parent, or friend whose quiet work made your life better even though they never asked for credit? We'd be honored to hear your story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories about veterans, courage, leadership, honor, sacrifice, friendship, faith, second chances, and the ordinary people whose unseen work continues changing lives every single day. May God bless you and your loved ones. Watch over every service member standing. Watch around the world. Protect every engineer whose work keeps others safe. Comfort every family remembering those who never came home. Strengthen every leader who chooses service over recognition. And remind all of us that the strongest foundations in life are never made of concrete. They are built from character, humility, compassion, and promises faithfully kept. And may you never forget that long after every building has disappeared, the lives we quietly help build will remain standing for generations to come.